Have you ever stopped to wonder how a simple word can just pop a picture into your head? Or how a single image can tell a whole complicated story? Well, today we're going to dive into the history of semiotics, which is just the fancy term for the study of signs. We're going to trace this long, totally fascinating quest to understand how we humans make meaning out of, well, everything. Okay, so what does a red traffic light have in common with the Mona Lisa? I know, it sounds like the start of a really weird joke, right? But the answer is actually pretty simple. They're both signs. One is a sign that tells you very clearly, stop your car. The other, well, that one's a sign that communicates a whole lot of complex ideas about beauty and mystery and history. The point is, they both work by communicating meaning. And figuring out how they do that, that's what semiotics is all about. Now, this whole idea, this curiosity about how signs work, it's not some modern thing we just came up with. Not at all. The roots of this go way, way back, all the way to the philosophical debates of the ancient world. Our journey really starts with the ancient Greeks, guys like Plato and Aristotle. They were the ones who first started wrestling with this big question of how words connect to the real world. Then, a little later, you get the Stoics, and they got really interested in what they called natural signs, things like a fever being a sign of sickness. But the real game changer was St. Augustine. He was one of the first to seriously dig into conventional signs, the symbols we humans just invent specifically to talk to each other. And that was a massive shift in thinking. And this brings us to the first major debate in our whole story. Was meaning just something you found out there in nature, or was it something that we as humans were actively building ourselves? This big pivot from thinking about natural signs to conventional ones, it really set the stage for everything that came next. So, what's the difference, really? Well, a natural sign has a direct physical link to what it means. Think smoke and fire. Where there's smoke, there's fire. It just happens, with or without us. But a conventional sign, like the word tree, has a link that's totally man-made. There's no real reason for it. We all just kind of agreed that this sound, tree, represents that big leafy thing in the ground. For centuries, this whole thing was just a doctrine of signs, a topic for philosophers to argue about. But then, in the late 17th century, it was finally about to get a proper name and be seen as its own unique branch of science. And the person who gave it that name was the philosopher John Locke. Back in 1690, he was the first to use the word semiotics. He defined it as one of the three great branches of science, right up there with physics and ethics. And its job? Pretty simple. To figure out how we use science to think and to share our knowledge with others. So Locke might have given the field a name, but it would take another 200 years for semiotics to really grow into its own formal discipline. And then, in the early 20th century, two thinkers who were working completely independently, they didn't even know about each other, would lay the groundwork for everything we know today. So on one side, you've got Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist. He called his field semiology, and he was totally obsessed with the structure of language. And on the other side, you have the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. He was focused on logic, and he developed this broader theory he called semiotics. They came from totally different backgrounds, they had different models, but together they built the modern field. All right, let's start with Saussure. For him, a sign was a two-part deal, kind of like a coin. On one side, you have the signifier. That's the sound or the image, like the actual word tree. On the other side, you've got the signified. That's the concept, the mental picture of a tree you get in your head. And here is Saussure's big, crucial point. The link between those two sides is completely arbitrary. There's nothing tree-like about the letters TREE. We've just all agreed as a culture that that word means that thing. Peirce, though, he saw it differently. To him, a sign wasn't a two-sided coin, it was more like a three-part relationship, like a triangle. First, you have the representamen, which is the sign itself. Then there's the object it's referring to, and finally you have the interpretant. That's the idea or the understanding that's created in your mind. For Peirce, meaning only really happens when all three of those pieces come together. This led to what is maybe Peirce's most brilliant and lasting idea, his breakdown of signs into three types. First, you've got the icon, which physically looks like the thing it represents. A portrait is a perfect example. Second is the index, which has a direct causal link to its object. Remember smoke and fire? Smoke is an index of fire. And finally, there's the symbol, which has zero inherent connection. Its meaning is totally conventional. It has to be learned, like the letters of the alphabet or the colors on a traffic light. Peirce also gave us this really powerful concept called semiosis. He basically argued that meaning is never static, it's always in motion. So look at this flow here. You see a sign, it connects to an object, and that creates an idea, an interpretant in your mind. But here's the cool part. That idea itself becomes a brand new sign. And that new sign connects to another object, creating another interpretant, and so on and so on. It's a never-ending chain of meaning. So, by the middle of the 20th century, semiotics was this super powerful tool. People were using it to analyze everything from literature to pop culture. But you know how it is, just as it was getting really established, it started to face some pretty deep challenges that questioned its most basic ideas. This is where semiotics really busts out of the academic world. A key player here was the French thinker Roland Barthes. He started applying all these ideas to everyday life. I mean, he analyzed things like professional wrestling matches and car ads to show how they create these modern myths, these deep-seated cultural messages and ideas that we just tend to accept without even thinking about it. But right when semiotics was hitting its stride, it ran into a huge critique from the philosopher Jacques Derrida. He came up with this really complex but fascinating idea of différance. Derrida said, look, if you look up a word in the dictionary, what do you find? Just more words. You never actually get to some final, stable, concrete meaning. Instead, meaning is always deferred, always getting pushed further down this endless chain of signifiers. It's constantly shifting. And the critiques didn't stop there. Michel Foucault came along and argued that these sign systems aren't neutral at all. They're actually shaped by power and by history. The people in charge get to decide what signs mean. And then Jean Baudrillard took it even further. He made this wild claim that in our modern, media-soaked world, signs have become totally detached from reality. They create what he called a hyper-reality, a world of symbols that only point to other symbols, not to the real world anymore. So, after all those critiques and evolutions, where does that leave the study of science today? You might be thinking it's a bit of a mess, but actually, it turns out it's more relevant and more widespread than it has ever been. Seriously, semiotics is a vital tool pretty much everywhere you look. It's used in advertising to create powerful brands, in UI design to make those little icons on your phone intuitive, and in social media to figure out what trends mean. It's even being applied to artificial intelligence and biosemiotics, the study of how animals communicate. It just keeps offering powerful ways to understand how meaning gets made in our crazy, complex world.
And that brings us to one final mind-bending question. We've spent literally thousands of years trying to understand the signs that we create as humans. But now, as artificial intelligence begins to generate its own images, its own language, its own symbols, what completely new systems of meaning are going to pop up? And how on earth are we going to learn to interpret them?